It's done.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Mack. Welcome to the 12th event in the 2021 iteration of the Popular Music Books in Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the Pop Conference, which has a new host institution, the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music at NYU. As always, thank you to my co-organizers, Eric Weisbart and Carl Wilson. Last week, we had a wonderful conversation between Chris Malanfi and Emily Lordy about Chris's book in progress for the Duke Singles book series, Old Town Road by Lil Nas X. And next week, on April 20th, Philip Auslander will be in conversation with Stan Hawkins about his new book, In Concert, Performing Musical Persona, published by the University of Michigan Press. And in case you're unaware, you can find the full 2021 schedule for Popular Music Books in Process events on the IASPM US website under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab, as well as previous recorded sessions on Eric's YouTube channel. Today, we're excited to have Regina Bradley and Imani Perry here, who will talk about Regina's new book, Chronicling Stankonia, The Rise of the Hip Hop South, published by the University of North Carolina Press. Dr. Regina Bradley is an alumna Nasir Jones HipHop Fellow. It was at the Hutchins Center at Harvard in spring of 2016, an assistant professor of English and African Diaspora Studies at Kennesaw State University, and co-host of the critically acclaimed Southern hip hop podcast, Bottom of the Map, with music journalist Christina Lee. Her expertise and research interests include post-civil rights African-American literature, hip hop culture, race in the contemporary US South, and sound studies. A prominent public voice and leading scholar on Southern hip hop culture and the Black American South, Dr. Bradley is the author of Chronicling Stankonia, The Rise of the Hip Hop South, and editor of the forthcoming collection of essays about OutKast titled An OutKast Reader for UGA Press. Imani Perry is the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and a faculty associate with the programs in Law and Public Affairs, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Jazz Studies. Perry is a scholar of law, literary and cultural studies, and an author of creative nonfiction. She is the author of 6 books, including Prophets of the Hood, Politics and Poetics in Hip Hop, May We Forever Stand, A History of the Black National Anthem, and Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry, which received the PEN Bograd Weld Award for Biography, the Phi Beta Kappa Christian Gauss Award for Outstanding Work in Literary Scholarship, the Lambda Literary Award for LGBTQ Nonfiction, and the Schiltz Gran Award for Nonfiction from the Publishing Triangle. Perry's forthcoming book, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation, under contract with Echo Press, is a narrative journey through the South, arguing that it is the nation's heartland for better and worse. And she was also just awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship in the field of intellectual and cultural history. After the discussion, there'll be a Q&A, which Eric will moderate. Please put your questions in the chat as they come to you, and Eric will find them there at the end of the discussion. So now I'll turn things over to Regina and Imani.
Thank you, Kim. Hey, Imani, Miss Guggenheim Fellow, Dr. Graham. How you?
How you doing?
I'm good. I'm feeling the whole, it used to be like the Van Vechten filter. The kids might not understand that, but I'm just saying it works. It's skin popping. I guess that's what happens when you are a award-winning fellow.
Well, I don't know about all that. Are we going to begin with some words from your extraordinary book? I have a lot to say, but
I'm gonna say it's gonna be real quick. It's gonna be quick. I promise.
So I'm not gonna say it until you have done your reading. So you can have. But go ahead.
Oh, okay. So again, hi everybody. Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming. Welcome. This is like a episode of Poach Talk. We on the Poach. It's finally nice outside in the South. The pollen's not whooping my ass, so it's nice to have the windows open a little bit. I want to just read a little bit from the introduction to Chronicling Stankonia, and then jump into this conversation with the illustrious Dr. Perry, because I have questions too. So without further ado, I'd like to read from the introduction. Chronicling Stankonia interrogates the cultural expressions of the post-civil rights hip-hop generations, Black Southerners who are twice removed from the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, and its immediate aftermath in the early 1970s. Specifically, I'm interested in excavating the experiences of Black Southerners who came of age in the 1980s and 1990s and used hip hop culture to buffer themselves from the historical narrative and expectations of civil rights movement era Blacks and their predecessors. I theorize this sociocultural landscape as the hip hop South, a hodgepodge of past, present, and future narrations of Southern Blackness. The hip hop South combines cornerstones of the past using hip hop to carve out a space where the complexity of experiences in the post-civil rights era can breathe. The contemporary Black South remains uncharted terrain, and Southern hip hop de-romanticizes the mountaintop as prime real estate and works it for what it is. An entanglement of race, place, and privileged memories that attempts to thwart the ideas and reflections outside of a suitable Southern spectrum that remains closely tied to the socio-historical boundaries of a Southern imagination. The hip hop South carves out room to work through the challenges of existing in the most recent cycles of the post-civil rights South. In returning to the mountaintop metaphor, for those marching and fighting for access to socio-political and economic equality, accessing the mountaintop is a hard-fought win. It is deemed enough for Black Southerners to have the mountaintop in sight. And once accessed, Blacks should have limitless opportunities and few obstacles to the American dream. Yet post-civil rights Black Southerners use hip hop to embrace the fact that the post-civil rights South is complicated and not unproblematic. It is demarcated by the complexity of living interstitially between memories of the past and present. And hip hop brings into focus the reality that the movement does not smooth out all the bumps in the road or provide a blueprint for navigating more recent obstacles and challenges. The cyclical nature of Southern memories, that is functioning plantations, Civil War reenactments, living history museums, is the foundation, but not the totality of a contemporary Southern experience. Thus, hip hop serves as a powerful intervener to address the continuously shifting negotiations of power, identities, and communities of Black people in the South. So yeah, that's from the book of introduction.
You know, I want to start by saying you are an extraordinary intellectual.
Thank you.
Yeah, I knew she was going to do that. Because no, I want to say this because it is extremely there's the sort of, you're doing the recuperative work of disrupting mythologies of the South, the way the South figures in the Black studies imagination, the way it figures in the Black imagination, the way it figures in the American imagination. Mm-hmm. It's one of the things that I think is really interesting is that like the African continent, the South is always posited as behind, past, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. So you're both engaging in sort of recuperating like the reality, the history, what it means to live amongst one's dead, right? Which is really what it's about, right? You know, so here's a present, but we are living with the ghosts that have defined the nation, right? Mm-hmm. And you're also doing something that I think I honestly cannot recall ever seeing for it, the relationship that you trace between popular music and contemporary Black Southern literature and all these forms of art. And to use a place, a location, a group, and theorize through history, race, music, right, is amazing. So I wanted to preface by saying that. So I think this book is really, for me, it's very important. And it's important for me in terms of someone who's interested in history, someone who's been interested in hip hop, right? You clarify, you clear the grounds, and also make this incredibly beautiful argument. So I want to ask, to begin with, why I want to ask about the figures that you have chosen, right? You know, it's not a book about Scarface. Oh. No, it's not a book about I want to ask about this choice. What is it that OutKast provides you as a lens for understanding history, understanding politics, and understanding Black art? Because you tell us all that in the book, but it's just for people who haven't yet read it. Yeah.
Well, because OutKast was my first introduction to all of that. When I first moved to Albany in the late 90s, it was weird because, you know, it was weird for a couple of reasons. It was full of transition. I was transitioning from the DMV, which is mini New York, sans go-go for the folks who are from DC. Don't come for me, I know. So it was like sans go-go, and for whatever was playing in New York was playing in DC, which ultimately was playing in Northern Virginia where I was living. And then to move to Albany, where nobody cares about Diddy, nobody cares about Wu-Tang, nobody cares. I was in a sinking ship, but everybody cared about OutKast. Everybody. I never met one person who was like, man, OutKast is weak sauce, they whack. And I'm like, I never heard that. But as I, became more familiar with what it meant to be in Albany as a teenager, as a young teenager, and music was our currency. Like, it was our way to engage. The one continuous staple was always OutKast and the Dungeon Family. And I think part of that is because, I was in Georgia. I was in Southwest Georgia, and Atlanta is right there. And Atlanta was our New York. You know what I'm saying? I think the other reason is that they were continuously in my ear. Like, their productivity was ridiculous. Every 2 years, you had a new cast album, right? And every 2 years, they reinvented themselves and introduced these different possibilities about what it meant to be Southern and Black and male, especially. So I felt like it was time. And as somebody who studies hip hop, and Imani, this is what I was going to ask you about, is, somebody from the South who studies hip hop, there's this assumption that, oh, of course, whatever happens in New York is going to trickle down and have the same impact in Georgia or in Alabama or in Mississippi. And I'm like, no, it's not. We're not the same thing. On the one hand, it's like the South isn't monolithic, so the music shouldn't be monolithic. The hip hop culture shouldn't be monolithic, and it's not. And I just wanted to use, the book to kind of show folks how, and why not start with the group that literally got booed off of hip hop stage and said that the South got something to say. You know what I'm saying? So that's why I decided to start there.
No, I mean, I think this is so important because, I just remember, I would be in Boston during the school year, and I go home to Alabama and I go to Chicago. Black kids were listening to very different things in all three places. Like, to the extent of, I've never heard of those people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that movement, and also different, like, hip hop was not alone. It was also go-go. It was also hyphy. It was also techno. It was also house music. That these were interconnected traditions. And so, one, you raise the significance of region, which is, you think, and I tried to do this, it didn't catch on with my first, but I tried to say, region, place is so important in hip hop, that it is not understood as a primary concern of every single artist is a huge mistake, right? So here, but I want to like draw attention to something you just said about Atlanta, because Atlanta is the metropole in a way that is not. New Orleans is a city. It's not the metropole in the same way. Houston is a big city. It's not the metropole. Certainly not Birmingham. Nobody's trying to come to Birmingham. There's a lot of urban South.
Yes.
But for Black people in the post-civil rights context, Atlanta has a very particular function, right?
Atlanta's where you go if you made it. You know how, how folks be like, New York is like, you make it here, you make it anywhere. But Atlanta was like, hold my beer type thing. You know what I'm saying? And I think, shout out to Maurice Hobson, his theorization about the Olympification of Atlanta, right? And also the leadership. So like Maynard Jackson has a huge reason why everybody wants to go to Atlanta and stay in Atlanta. Like, not just come and visit, like y'all just want to stay, you know what I'm saying? There's that aspect of it. But he starts the Office of Cultural Affairs. He starts the Jazz Festival. He opens up this possibility. And then, his wife, Bunny Jackson Ransom, opens up this further possibility with funk music, which for me, that's my introduction to Atlanta, because my dad was a huge funk fan. And every Sunday we would get into the town car after he washes it, and we would listen to Cameo and Gap and SOS Band. And I need to know why, you got to be good to me, but not these other girls out here like I hear, you know what I'm saying? I don't care about them other girls, just be good to me. Just be good to me. So yeah, I just, there's a difference. The groundwork, the infrastructure was there. And I think what Atlanta hip hop in particular does for the city is it's the mirror, it's the reminder, like everybody does not have a white linen suit in their back, you know, next to their AUC education on Cascade, the good side of Cascade. You know what I'm saying? All of these things are still happening, right? So like when I talk about this idea that the South is a regional poltergeist, that's what I'm talking about. I mean, like, we're haunted by everything. Not only are we living in the shadow of the civil rights movement, but we're also dealing with the figures that continue to haunt us, the sanitization of the figures that continues to haunt us. You know what I'm saying? Like, everybody likes to say Dr. King and all lives matter and, you know, all these things like that. And I'm just like, yeah, that lets me know you really ain't listening to Dr. King like that, because, you know, the other Dr. King was also like, run me my check. The other Dr. King was like, you know, this might have been a mistake. Like, I'm integrating my people into a burning house. That Dr. King. We don't hear about that Dr. King. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I mean, like, I think it's a lot. And then, you know, kind of going back to Du Bois, and Du Bois was like, Atlanta is the city on the hill. You know what I mean? I mean, like, there's a lot that comes along with that a lot of other hubs come to. But what I wanted to ask you though, Imani, is like, why did you include OutKast in 2004 in Prophets of the Hood? Because there would be no Chronicling Stankonia without your theorization that an urban South, you know what I'm saying, exists. So what was it about them then? You know what I mean? What stood out to you? Was it Andre? I know it was.
No, it actually was not. I was late to Andre. Appreciation. No, it was, it's hard. I had, you know, people, that exchange when, you know, they said the South got something to say. Oh gosh. It's hard to grow up around people who act as though your people don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved hip hop, but I had also had a life with people being like, I know you go home and there's chickens and no street lights and stuff. And I'm like, do you not know? Like, you could just look at the footage of 1963, since y'all like to pull it out every January, right? The dogs. It's a city. Birmingham is a city. Birmingham is a city that made so much possible for y'all. And then sort of casting it as nothing. And so when OutKast first came out, it just felt like, to hear, and you know, they have a different accent, but it's close, a lot closer than New York folks, right? And the sound. And so to me, and also I was like, but this is the thing, right? This is the thing that when me and KSA first having conversations eons ago, when hip hop stole my Black boy, this is the thing that people don't realize. This is the heart. This is the core that allows hip hop to be possible, right? You know, you cannot listen to Stagger Lee and Dolomite and not understand this is the root. And yet people totally circumvented it. You can't think about this verses with the Isley Brothers and Earth, Wind and Fire, listening to the samples, right? Or James Brown. There's a reason the sound, the invocation of this root sound of the Black South. So for me, I was like, something different is happening. Also, and I tell the story about going into movie theater in Boston and hearing all these people use Southern terms. And I was like, what is happening? Oh, it's the Hot Boys, right? Like people, right? And so like seeing also something that was turning at that point. And certainly I don't think the music would not have had the longevity or the depth that it has had it not been for, and that's in the Midwest too, the expansion of the map, right? So that's that's a piece of it. Yeah.
I mean, I think I laugh because, you know, since you brought up Stagger Lee, I mean, you know, Big Boy Swagger.
Yes.
Is a Stagger Lee. I mean, like, for the folks who are uninitiated, he's why you got a bad man, right? I mean, like, he has multiple remixes. He got Stagger Lee, Shine, you know what I'm saying? Like, one of my favorite things to share with my students is Shine on the Titanic.
It's the best.
And the idea, like, and Shine swam on, you know what I'm saying? So there's, I think too, one of the things I most appreciate about Southern rap particularly is that we don't stray from the messy. and the angry, and you know what I'm saying, you could have a Stagger Lee, you have a Big Boy, you have a Scarface, or probably even more so somebody like a Bushwick Bill, you know what I'm saying, who is like, yeah, let's do that.
Issue, all those sorts of things that people, which we also can't stray from, because everything is always happening in our communities. People aren't institutionalized. People aren't sent away, right? You just make do with all of the messiness of life. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, you know, and you know, you shake something to it. I mean, for real. Like, I think that's one of the biggest things, especially for, you know, colleagues who are purists, who are hip hop purists, who have been in my inbox, who are like, you know, be careful that you're not revising hip hop history. And I'm like, I can't revise some shit that y'all wasn't even thinking about in the first place, which is the reason that I needed to write a Chronicling Stankonia. Like, there's still this assumption that if the scholarship is applicable to, you know, the Mecca, so to speak, then that's the way that it manifests everywhere. And I'm like, there's so many distinct distinctions regionally that the academy is still,
it's completely
shy to even acknowledge, you know what I mean? And I'm like, I need y'all to do better. Like, I need y'all to do better, better.
Let me ask you this, just related, because what you just said made me think of, there are people who wrote hip hop scholarship about toasts and ballads that did not include any of those that came out of the South, even though that's actually the point of connection, right? This is a genre that you find in the Caribbean and you find in the Deep South. So it's part of what was hip hop could create, because you have migrants from all over in New York that have, oh, this is something we share, right? So let me ask you about archival techniques, given the reality of what's happened in it, like, and also you have a kind of you are a writer, like a writer, right? And you do. No, but I mean, you care about words and about composition, and you also you have a way to systematize talking about things that you saw, right? Like, and I'm interested in you talking about that, because that's one of those things that people are encouraged to shy away from, but which actually really enriches your project. You know.
So the first thing immediately is that I have to center myself, because I've been erased on so many different levels. I've been erased as a Black woman in the academy. I've been erased as a Southern Black woman who studies hip hop in the academy. God forbid it's Southern hip hop that I study, right? So, you know, there's that aspect of it. I wanted to push back against what people consider to be critical engagement with culture. And I couldn't, and I tried when I first started writing this book. I tried to be as formal as I could and use all the big GRE words like temporality and discourse and all the whatever little buzzwords from, you know, going to SEM I could remember in terms of speaking with my fellow ethnomusicologists. I tried to include them, but it didn't come together because it felt fake. You know what I'm saying? Like I couldn't do it. And then I was like, how can I not explain that the reason that I came to OutKast and the reason they're important is because they introduced me, you know what I'm saying? So I feel like, you know, when we write about the South, when Southerners write about the South, I mean, like, you know, how we're speaking, we're not just speaking for ourselves, you know what I mean? Like that communal element is such a significant part of how we engage in the world around us. You know what I mean? Like if it's not coming through the community, more than likely we're not gonna know about it. You know, it's like, oh, okay. So I feel like the archive for me was multiple levels for this project, and I'll probably peel apart those layers in later projects. But you know, one, the idea that Southern Blackness is cyclical, it's not linear, I think is such a significant understanding to why we need to have these conversations. So, you know, it doesn't just happen in 1866, right? And then that's it. Like, no, it happened in 1866 and it's coming back around in 1916 and it's coming back around again and again and again. And, you know, for me, like the Confederate monuments, for example, you would think that has nothing to do with Southern hip hop culture. It has everything to do with Southern hip hop culture. The iconography, right? I'm thinking about Brad Paisley's Accidental Racist, which, you know, I can't forgive him for a couple of reasons. One, no Southern rappers were available because LL Cool J out here in his New York swagger talking about, if you forgive my gold chains, I'll forget the iron chains. And meanwhile, those of us who live up the street from a plantation, your girl, are like, what? Or, you know, folks wear the rebel flag, you know what I mean? Like, I remember Andre wearing the rebel flag in the Miss Jackson video, and Lil Jon and the East Side Boys wore the flag on, I think, it was Kings of Crunk. Was it Kings of Crunk? It was one of those, but he was still with the East Side Boys.
Yeah. And then
I'm
there was
like,
that black one that came out of Atlanta, the like red, black, and green Confederate flag in the 90s.
yeah, then they remixed and I'm just like, y'all gonna remix remix the remix. You know what I'm saying? And still, like, you have these conversations now. You're having conversations about, you know, the politicization of Southern rap. I'm like, we've always been political. We might not have used the language, you know what I mean? But it's always been political. Before there was Killer Mike, there was Cujo Goody. You know what I'm saying? It's like, you know what I'm saying? So I think that's important, and it also speaks to the dynamic complexities that all of us have, because what's considered to be agency driven in Georgia or even Alabama, because we're neighbors, you know what I'm saying, is different than what's considered to be needed to be agency in like Houston.
Right.
You know what I mean? So yeah, I feel like the archive is important because it allows us to have that opportunity to go back and forth. You know what I mean? It also, I'm like, and I think too, Southern hip hop serves as a peculiar type of archive, because a lot of the places that people talk about no longer exist.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? It's almost like they haunt the music. It's like, okay, I'm from this place. You know, I'm like the hyper locale is an aesthetic in hip hop that goes, doesn't matter where in the region you are, but I'm like, there's in a lot of places in the South, whether it's due to gentrification or just simply folks just, you know, got displaced.
With Magnolia Project, which is now Harmony Oaks, right? Mixed income dwelling, right? And there's all these, and it literally was built on top of a graveyard, a black graveyard. So there's like all these layers in the, that's so beautiful. I know people have questions, and I'm going to stop in a moment, but I want to say one thing and ask you one thing. So I think I want to just emphasize for folks who are listening now and will continue to listen, is because there's a kind of resistance in academic spaces to using a personal archival record. Mm-hmm. But because of the way in which archiving is unequally distributed, it's in many times the only way that you can get to the truth of Black experiences, because that which isn't recorded, that which isn't collected, that which isn't, right? So I think that there's something radically important about telling, like witnessing, essentially, witnessing one's own life. And then I wanted to ask you, because there's some, you have a discussion of her work in your book. I want you to talk a little bit about Jessamine. And I want you to talk about her in relationship to your project and because, as also happens, she's so deeply rooted in this.
Still want to act like she ain't Southern.
Well, yeah.
See, I was trying to avoid this part of the conversation, but for the record, you brought this up. Okay. I am a huge fan. I absolutely love Jessamine Ward. I am honored to call her a friend. You know what I'm saying? And when I talk to her about these things, sometimes she's like, you're my knight in shining armor, because you always hold me down when other folks can't. I'm like, that's right. But I mean, I chose that first book because that's before everybody was checking for Jessamine Ward. Where the Line Bleeds is a trap story. She is a trap novelist, and she laughs every time I call her a trap novelist. But it's true, right? So when we think about trap as a subgenre of Southern hip hop, it speaks to, surface level, it speaks to working class Black men who are out here dealing, which is not that far removed from corner boy music that you would hear in New York. The distinction is the production. That's what makes trap, right? And when I would read and teach, Where the Line Bleeds, all of that started coming to the forefront. You have these two, barely graduated high school, twins, so that's important too. Twins, one can find a job. He starts working at the docks. The other one can't find a job, so he starts to sling. You know what I'm saying? And the humane way that she treats even the characters that folks feel like shouldn't have that humanity. You know, the addicts, the dealers. You know, these folks who aren't respectable enough in higher class society be acknowledged as human beings, right? That stood out for me. And I was like, oh, okay. So, you know, she gets put on everybody else's radar with Salvage the Bones, which also can be considered a trap novel, because, you know what I'm saying, Esha's brother's relationship with his pit, it's not like a poodle, it's not a German Shepherd, it is a pit. Yeah. You can't tell me that ain't Southern. I'm not saying that everybody else, it's just like, yeah, the dog fighting aspect of it, right? I mean, like, you know, she didn't demonize it. Post-Vic though, like post-Vic.
To me, that's what that book, because the narrative was one such that you can understand. Her brother loves that dog, right?
Yes.
You are in a place
was willing to drown to save the dog.
That, so it's not intended as animal abuse. It is a characterization of what it means to have to fight for your life, right? It's a yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, but it's like, you know, how does she start her novels? Like, she started Where the Line Bleeds with Pastor Troy. You know what I'm saying? And it wasn't just like, you know, Animal Playing GA Pastor Troy. It was vice versa Pastor Troy. The question about what if, right? Like what if this happened? What if? And how does she further do that? She uses twins, like twin brothers. You know what I'm saying? So it's like she's playing with all of these things. And then she comes out with, you know what I'm saying, Men We Reaped. And her friends were dope boys and addicts and all of the, and like just the way that she grieved was such a familiar thing for me, because I grieved in similar ways. You know, I had a friend who was at a botched robbery, got shot in the back of the head, and was in a vegetative state for 2 weeks. When we got word that he had passed, right after the period, like right after lunch, folks already took markers on white shirts and were like, RIP Black, you know what I'm saying? So I think what Jasmine Ward does is shows, one, that Southern hip hop culture is more than just rap. Like, it actually is part of everyday experiences. But I also think the way that she uses trap is to allow folks to grieve and let that grief breathe. You know what I'm saying? There's not, you know, because Southern Black folks do death. We are very particular about how we do death. It's a whole, there's spectacle, but there's also speculation. You know what I'm saying? But I think, yeah, so, you know, she uses the trap aesthetic to mourn. You have Josh or Christoph, who's like, I can't find a job. I don't want to do this shit, but I have to do this shit. You know what I mean? And you put that in conversation with somebody like T.I., who, you know, he's been on that bullshit lately, but I mean, like, the way that he humanizes trap.
Right. He tells a story.
He tells the story, right? Like, and embraces, like, he's frustrated and he's hurt and all of these things. So it really kind of, you know, the reason that Jasmine is so important is that folks want to make her quote unquote highbrow writing. So how do you make a Southern writer highbrow? You compare them to somebody like William Faulkner.
Oh, I'm so tired of the Faulkner comparison.
Yeah, but it's like every time it's like, oh, well, you know, the Faulkner, you know, she's Faulknerian in the, and I'm just like, she's not Faulknerian. She's Mimi. She is Jasmine Ward. You know what I mean? And I'm sick of that shit, because Faulkner could give two damns about Black people, because Black people were the stepping stone. They were never the center. And with Jasmine, Black folks is always centered. You'll forget that there are white folks in the book, with the exception of like Sing Unbury Sing. But even then, it's like, it's not the focus.
He's up in the cut, so it's a different kind of
yeah, but it's kind of like, oh, okay. So I mean, like, all of that to say is that, you know, the use of a trap aesthetic to grieve, the use of a trap aesthetic to, you know, you're talking about witnessing, right? Like, I think what people get turned off about academic conversations about hip hop, because they want to like take out all the humanity in the subject, because they feel like, you know, they'll be seen a certain way. And for me, you can't, Because I mean, like, you know, ultimately what I wanted to do with the discussions that I present in the book is I want to continue those conversations that I had with friends at the cafeteria table, which is the first peer review. The cafeteria table is your first peer review process, because you can't sit there unless you've done the reading, done the listening, you know what I mean? And you can't do that just listening to the radio, you know what I mean? So yeah, I mean, like, it's part of us. It's more than just music. Like it infiltrates in so many different ways, from food, you know what I mean? I'm thinking about like Slim and Huskies, you know what I mean? Like they take Southern hip hop legends and make pizzas after them, you know what I'm saying? To literature, to the way that we grieve.
See,
death, how we think about death. Hip hop influences that, especially Scarface, but you know, we had a conversation later.
But this is the heart, and I really am going to let people ask questions. But this is in some sense the core to me of why it's so important for you to place Jasmine along, and honestly alongside OutKast, because OutKast, there are people who also try to pull them out of this, which is remarkable. But it's
especially 3 Stacks. I'm like, how?
Right, and also there's so many different problems. But for me, the heart of it is that you get to the virtuosity of everyday living in Black, and I mean that both in terms of like excellence, right? Like, so when we say something like if we say she can't sing, that doesn't mean she literally can't sing. That means you have not completed the task of becoming excellent at this, right?
Right.
You say someone is incompetent because they're mediocre. And so when you talk about the cafeteria table as the peer review, that's serious, right? When we talk about, you know, what it means to navigate, like literally what it means to navigate the streets, that requires a sophisticated understanding of the landscape, right? So there's all these layers, and then you have the sensitivity, and you have grandmamas right here. Right, they're not. I mean, I can see the places right in the line of sight. I can remember my grandmother calling City Hall, get these folks off the street, right? Like, right. So for me, what you started with, I just want to, in my part of asking you questions, what you started with, because one of the things you said at the beginning is about the respectable face, the civil rights movement respectability face, and so. I take part of what you're doing also to be reclaiming what the face is. Y'all, that public image, which was part of an argument for a certain kind of inclusion and part of a civil, you don't get to be the face of this region anymore.
Well, no, because I'm offended and I'm petty. Like, why are you trying to use a 1968 king? And I wasn't born until the 80s. Like, help me understand. like real talk, you know what I'm saying? That's like, oh, okay. So it grinds in my spirit for a couple of reasons. It flattens what the South is socially, culturally, the movement, and then on top of that, it's only particular narratives associated with the movement. So it's the, you know, the we shall overcome and the Sunday's best, and you know, we don't hear about, you know, everybody else who was putting in the work. Like I was when I talked to folks at Harvard last week, one of the things that stood out for me during my time there was that I found a student research piece in the Harvard newspaper from 1961 where dude ended up in Albany with the CME gang. Now, the CME gang is about that life. Like my church is in CME, the CME neighborhood. You know what I mean? And I'm like, I know he ain't talking about just the neighborhood. I know he's talking about the actual gang. And the gang member and the CME dude was like, you know, yeah, they trying to do the civil rights movement shit, but I don't know if that's for me, but I can show you how to make some change.
Which is important, yes.
Yeah, like he's like, yeah, like I know, you know what I'm saying? And I'm just like, yeah, those are the stories that we don't hear. We don't hear about the folks who be at the juke joints who are like, no, for real, maybe you need to go out and vote. We don't hear about the folks who was at the, you know, the diners. I mean, of course you hear about like the Woolworth counter, you know what I mean? But I'm talking about the folks who was like at the juke joint, at the club, selling plates. Like we selling plates to raise money to get these folks up out of jail. Like those folks.
That showed up with guns when people were attacking.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Like, escort them out, like, because that's the thing that I think, like, the gun culture is what it is now, but it is also the same as it was then, right? Like
The
that was
I'm outside culture, the I'm outside, like, you know, you told me to pull up, I'm outside, you know, like that didn't just start with hip hop. My grandfather, who was an educator, you know what I'm saying? He was building the house that my grandmother still lives in today. And his neighbors were white, and they would follow my grandmother home and try to run her off the road, and they would threaten him, and they were like, we're gonna come for you next. And my granddad and all his gangsterness was like, cool, wait, I'll wait for you. I'll wait for you at the road. And he had his shotgun in the back of the window. They didn't follow him home after that. You know what I'm saying? But it's like, but in a national narrative, my granddad is like, oh, that's just the exception to the rule. No, the hell it's not. Like, there's this, you know, so like this goes into the conversations, like when I hear my students sometimes who are like, oh, you know, I'm not my ancestors. And I'm like, bruh, you better wish you were your ancestors, because you wouldn't be here if they wasn't about that life. Like there wasn't just rollover ancestors, you know what I'm saying? It wasn't just rollover people, but because we see and we're consistently inundated with like eyes on the prize and particular like John Lewis's narrative and the need to vote, you know what I mean? Like that pushes out other less than savory narratives. Like everybody talks about Rosa Parks, you know what I'm saying? And Rosa Parks and what she sacrificed. And yes, she did, but nobody talks about Rosa Parks, the yoga master. Nobody talks about Rosa Parks, the sexual assault investigator. We only hear about Rosa Parks on the bus, in the same way that we're just now giving Claudette Colvin her flowers, when technically she was first. You know what I mean? Or you see folks having this rise of interest in like Fannie Lou Hamer, which I feel very, very gatekeeperish when it comes to folks talking about folks from the South and they ain't got no invested interest in the South. You know what I'm saying? Because Fannie Lou Hamer was Southern as hell, like
extremely so.
Extremely. And it was Mississippi Southern, which is its own, you know what I mean, distinct thing. So, you know what I mean? I just feel like the culture is an opportunity. You talking about like reclamation work. I feel like this is reclamation work too. Is like to pull out those folks who influenced what was going on, and then, you know, bringing them into a new type of conversation. And I think what's also interesting too, and then I'll shut up, right, is that the tensions that exist generationally between, you know, there are multiple generations of post-civil rights Southerners now, multiple generations.
Right. And the genealogy is different based on location, because if if you come out of the rural South, that's a different historiography and generations than yeah.
You know, it's different. It's different out here, right? Like, you know, folks with, like, I think on Twitter last week I said like, retweet if you ever met your great grandparents. And I'm like, met them, like spent time with them, talk to them, like, you know, it's like
under them, yes.
You know, all day business, you know what I'm saying? But it's interesting that you have older generations of Southerners who are actually subscribing to these sanitized scripts, because they want to make sure that young Southerners don't forget. And in their mind, in order for us to show that we are appreciative of the sacrifice, we have to be exceptional.
Yes, that is a lot of pressure.
It's a lot of pressure, right? Like, I mean, like it's a lot, you know what I'm saying? And I know you can feel me on this, as somebody whose grandparents, you know, my folks were educators, so that I was always in school. I was in school from the time I could say school until 29. You know what I'm saying? So
you're still in school.
Right? Yeah. But it's just, you know, it's interesting. And then I'm seeing this like rash of interest in the South, and I'm like, well, who they people is? Like talk to me about who they people is, why they interested, why they want to write about it. And I'm like, I don't want to be a gatekeeper, but I want to be a gatekeeper. Like, don't be trying to say this is what the South is and you have no investment in it. Like and you don't want to acknowledge the complexity of what the social landscape actually can do. You know what I mean?
Or can't speak the language, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So.
Want to go to questions?
Yeah, I think probably this is a good moment to open things up for some questions, if that's okay. So we've got a few people who've put their hands up, and I'd love to hear from some more people as well. But it's very easy for me to invite one Ann Powers to ask a question.
Ceremonial role to ask the first question. That was such a great discussion. I love to hear all of these points, and I'm just going to ask one question, even though I could go anywhere right now from all you say. And Gina, when you were talking earlier about the messy and Southern rap incorporating the messy, I love this idea, the way you're playing with it in the book and in what you're talking about. And I'm specifically curious, like the relationship that you bring up between the messy and rage, and how you see it happening in Southern rap in connection to or in contrast with Southern California rap, and the way that I always think of it, menace, I think of that word. Perhaps I'm taking that from Menace to Society. I don't know. But there's a kind of a laid back, this laid back rage that characterizes Southern California sound. But I might be making unfair generalizations. And so that's my first part A of my question. My part B is, how do you also think about the eccentricity or craziness of certain Southern rappers, how they direct that in their own personae, like Wayne, or in a very different, I would say, maybe gentler way, but not always. I mean, Andre himself. And how does that connect to these issues and to the issue of resistance? Why are you laughing, Eric?
That's a lot of question.
It's good question. Thank you, Ann, because that means Ann read my book. So yeah, thank you for the, I want to do the rage one first. I feel like they're distant cousins, right? I don't want to sit here and be like Southern hip hop happened in a vacuum, because it didn't. But I'm not going to sit here and also be like, folks in the South weren't listening to the NWAs, the Ice Cubes, and the MC8s, folks like that. I think what's interesting though is that if with rage in West Coast rap, and for the West Coast rap scholars who are in attendance, this is me just kind of spitballing. I'm not trying to, this is my disclaimer. But I think what's interesting is that because the violence that they talk about, the psychological, emotional, even economic violence that takes center stage in their narratives, is so documented in a way that folks don't question its validity. That there's that extra little bit of wiggle room in ways that in the South, that's not necessarily the case, because kind of like what me and Imani were saying earlier, we have to actually show and prove that, yeah, folks did get buck in the South, right? There was the Deacons of Self-Defense, for example. There was the Lowndes County community, like folks down here had guns, right? So I'm thinking about AKs, but we will shoot back, right? So there's like that consistent pushing back against this narrative that folks want to accept, and then the reality of what that narrative is. So I think too, I think that folks took their cue, right, from West Coast artists. I also think that there was a lot more of a repertoire between West Coast artists and Southern artists, because New York was being bougie. You know what I mean? Like, oh, okay. But, the other part of it too, and this is something I talk to my students about, is when we think about things like the Great Migration, what's missing, and this is the biggest issue I had with what I read from Charles Blow on the Great Migration, is that it wasn't just bodies that were blank slates and left. They took culture, they took slang, they took emotions, they took food, they brought it with them. It wasn't like they just all of a sudden started over, and that kind of laid the groundwork. So I feel like there's a lot of connection between California and the South, multiple parts of the South. You know what I mean? Mississippi in particular, well, yeah, we everywhere, we out here. That's the whole thing about why we're out here. So I feel like that was already set up, and that that was the model, right? And in terms of, thinking about the eccentric part of it, this is where, Francesca Royster's work is so good, because she talks about, how it queer stuff, so to speak. But I think part of it is with somebody like a 3 Stacks and a Lil Wayne who have international stardom, there's no need to check in with reality that a lot of us have to. So if the man want to go out there in his shoulder pads and his platinum blonde wig, you know what I'm saying? Nobody's going to be like, oh, okay. Like they're going to let him do it. So the celebrity lets him do it. But also that's the reason that we love him, so to speak, is because he never does what we want him to do. If Andre 3000 did what we wanted him to do, we would have had like 4 or 5 albums by now.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, like, you know, he says that Prince is his model, and I feel like he took that from Prince, is that he probably has vaults full of music that we'll never hear or never see the light of day. He just wanted to get it out of his system. You know what I'm saying? But you know, somebody like Wayne is different, I think, from 3 Stacks, because we never get any hot takes from Andre, with the exception of Young Thug. I think that was his only hot take that he gave us, and we were like, the fuck, like, you know what I mean? But we don't hear about his political ideas. We don't hear about, you know what I'm saying? You know, he did the t-shirt fundraiser for Black Lives Matter Incorporated, I think, like Matter for Black Lives. He's a fundraiser. But that's it. Like, we don't hear him, you know, out here. Now, Wayne, on the other hand, okay, this... he out here being associated with Trump, which is fascinating to me, because if you put 2020, 2021 Wayne in conversation with like 2005 Wayne, Georgia Bush Wayne, I feel like 2005 Wayne would whoop 2020 Wayne's ass. Like, you know, first of all, your hair out here looking like a 3-piece fried catfish plate, because the lean has dried your ass out. Like the lean has dried you out. And I'm not even coming for him for, you know, because addiction is a very real thing. But you say the stupidest shit and don't expect nobody to say anything. And you're still resting on them laurels about when you was the best rapper alive. Are you still the best rapper alive, Weezy? Probably not. Probably because you feel like you don't have to be. You know what I mean? So I just feel like it's a pass for a lot of folks, that eccentric side. And I want to say this too, because I feel like I've said this before, but I want to say this again. The reason that we have a 3 Stacks is because we had a big boy who did not rock the boat until he was doing his own solo music. You know what I'm saying? He kept the balance, so to speak. Like he kept the OutKast brand sonically in ways that Dre was like, nah, I don't wanna, I'm gonna do what I want. Like if I'm gonna just sing falsetto all the way through Speaker Box, The Love Below, and you know what I'm saying, do that. And then Big Boy was like, okay, cool, I need to stay along those similar lines with something like a Speaker Box. And we don't get a Love Below from Big Boy until Dangerous Lies and Vicious Rumors, where you're like, oh, okay, he's experimenting. And then he does the duo with Fantagram and Big Grams. So it's, yeah, I just feel like, you know, the celebrity is kind of like that veil, so to speak, that if you have enough celebrity, you can pretty much do what you want unapologetically. And that's something that Andre is still, I think the only one who can do what Andre is doing is maybe Beyonce. If Beyonce started going around here with, you know, the Wood Flute Tour when the airports get back open. And yeah, maybe that's something. So I hope I answered your question, Anna.
Thank
Do we even need questions? These are great. Windsor Jordan, if you'd like to ask your question. Did we lose Windsor? I'm looking. No, you're here.
I'm still here. I'm still. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. What's up?
Excellent. This is a wonderful conversation. I appreciate it so much. I did my work at Lee University, and I spent a lot of time studying Stack Lee and connection to current hip hop voices. I'm just very curious, kind of how has that archetype of Stack Lee continued to evolve in hip hop culture, related to Southern hip hop or more broadly? How is an archetype growing with some of the newer artists? How has it changed or shifted in this new era of hip hop culture? And again, thank you to both of you. It's been a wonderful conversation to listen to.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know what? I'm gonna say something that might not be popular, what I'm about to say. I feel like the bad man narrative is almost strictly performative in rap now. And what I mean by that is the folks who actually are the Staggerlees, the Shines, get taken out before their prime. You know, especially in the South, especially in Atlanta these last couple of years, man, you know, from somebody like Bankroll Fresh, for example, or even he's not Southern, but I mean, you know, we claim him with somebody like a Pop Smoke, for example, who was a lot of folks say about to be the next king of New York, right? Are taken out in their prime. The way that they deliver their raps continues. Like folks bite their style, but not necessarily can back up the street life element of it. And I think too, you know, the other side of that is I feel like a lot of the Stagger Lees from the 90s and early 2000s are pawpaws now and are, you know, I feel like Stagger Lee's not supposed to get old. Does that make sense? It's like if you're the bad man, you're not supposed to make it to the ripe old age of 75, 80. And unfortunately and tragically, that is still kind of proven the case, especially for these younger folks who are out here. I think the other side of it too is when we think about the bad man, a lot of the artists now try to embrace the bad man, but like the bad man with a soft side or the bad man with the one humane flaw. You know what I'm saying? So like if we think about somebody like Biggie Smalls, for example, and he gives you the 10 crack commandments, like one of the crack commandments is, you know, you never get high off your own supply. And now you have folks who have built, you know, careers off of, yeah, I sell it, but I also consume it. Like, wait, what? Right? So I don't know. I just feel like that's actually a really interesting thing to kind of dig into a little bit further. But I do feel like the bad man trope is not necessarily taking a hiatus, but I mean, like, is the tragedy associated with it. It seems more like a tragic figure in the culture now, more so than, you know, somebody who talks shit, you know what I'm saying, and backs it up. So I hope that answers your question, Wednesday. That was a great question. Thank you for that.
In some ways, that leads well into our next question. Chris Malanphy?
I say, Chris, I see you in the chat. You better talk to me. I'm not about to read this 11 word paragraph.
You got it, Gina. You've been on my show. You know how long I can go on. Here we go. All right, so I always love hearing you on this topic. And I appreciate you saying that to you, late 90s, early aughts is another golden era, right?
Yes.
Speaking of which, and the distinctions between Southern and Northeast hip hop. I wonder if the death of Yonkers native DMX this weekend felt like a moment of passage for, let's call it hegemonic rap.
Yes.
I mean, yeah, right? I mean, like everybody's saying that post Run DMC, post BE, post Nas, DMX had a roughly half-decade reign as one of, or maybe for a couple of years, the king of New York hip hop alongside the rise of Jay-Z. This same peak, this is what I find interesting, where your work is concerned. This same peak coincides with OutKast's peak. Like Aquemini is contemporaneous with the first two DMX CDs. Stankonia
98 was a year, man.
98 was a year, right?
Yeah.
Stankonia in 2000 falls between X's third and fourth.
Yeah.
So what was New York building when OutKast was busy shifting rap's center of gravity south? I mean, was this New York's last gasp? And I suppose that ignores 50 Cent, but whatever.
I mean, the only 50 Cent that I still take serious is Get Rich or Die Trying 50 Cent as an artist.
Right.
He was hungry. I feel like you need to ask somebody from New York from that, because there was so much things that were popping in Southern rap that I was like, oh, I'm over here. It was at the same time you got the rise of DMX, and DMX was hot in Albany. I'm not even gonna sit here and be like, no, we ain't listen to no DMX. But I mean, like, you know, it's dark and hell is hot. And I think the thing that really touched a lot of Southern folks' spirit was the Christianity element of it, because a lot of us were in the Bible Belt, so we understood that struggle that he would put on every single album. But I think, you know, I'm not the one to answer this question, Chris, to be honest with you, because I'm like in 98, you have the height of No Limit, you have Aquemini, you have the rise of Cash Money, you know what I mean? I think what's happening with that shift of folks coming south is the collaborations. Like, you have some of these New York artists who are starting to get it. Raekwon is starting to get it. Right. You know what I'm saying? Swiss Beats is starting to get it, right? So it's like, when I think about especially somebody like DMX and the collabs that he did with Southern artists, I'm just like, yeah, about, you know, Down Bottom. I think about the Rough Rider anthem. I think about, you know, World War III in particular. Like, folks sleep on that particular track. World War III slap. Okay. But it's important to kind of see like that opening up also added to the complexity of it, you know, like the complexity of it. And I also think, you know, for folks in New York, At the same time that they were opening up the possibility, at least sonically, to having regional differences, you know, lyrically folks want to be like, oh, well, you know, they don't do this and it's still killing the culture, and the South killed rap. And I'm like, the South didn't kill rap, we made it better.
I'm a New Yorker and I agree.
You know what I mean? I'm like, we made it better, but we also, you know, we have home training, so we don't brag like that. We don't brag on the genius like that, unless you know, push comes to shove, and then it's all of that. But yeah, I think that right now I feel like we're in a series of posts. You know what I mean? We're post digital, we're post, you know, Y2K, we're post Katrina, all of these, like we're in this kind of level of post, and we're still trying to figure out where we're going to land. The other thing I find really interesting about your question is that if I think about younger generations of hip hop enthusiasts, right, they don't have that same center of gravity that we did in the 90s, where you recognize the predecessors. Because we're in this digital moment where it feels like, because we have instant access to it, we Wikipedia everything. That if I can just give this real quick footnote, okay, and not actually do the homework, I mean, like, that's part of the history that gets lost. I think that's one of the things that makes older cycles of hip hop so dope, is that we're making something new, we're remixing this without losing sight of where it came from. Now you can just go online and go to Bandcamp or SoundCloud and be like, I want to sound like I'm Southern today. And not do that homework that a lot of previous artists had to do. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I don't know what's going on with New York up there. You know what I mean? But if 50 is the last king in New York, we need to have a conversation. I'm just saying, I love it. I love it. Thank you, Chris. That was a great question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Let me ask, I'm not sure, Nina, that you ever totally asked a question, but you've been all over the chat, so I feel like you want to ask a question. Do you want to ask a question, Nina?
I don't know. I'm just really feeling this because I'm from Georgia, and I always really feel what Gina had to say. I think what you were talking about just now is really interesting, though, about a link to origin, and how that might not be as important now. And
well, because it's social media, everything is instantaneous. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like this is the Android generation. It's like, if you don't get it immediate answer, then, you know, folks lose their shit, right? I mean, like, there's a reason that TikTok is so popular. It's literally 30 seconds to a minute. If you can't keep my attention, in, that's it. And that attention span has been reflected in the ways that we listen. When I was talking about OutKast in '98, I got a full ass album. I got a beginning with the prelude. I got a couple of interludes, a couple of sketches, you know, and at least 2 hours worth of music. Give me like about 18 to 25 tracks, and I have a full conceptual album. Now albums are 4 songs. 4 songs that usually are between, you know, 2 and 3.5 minutes. So like, by the time I'm starting to feel the song, like, it makes me, I think about it like this. For those of us who understand the gospel that is back that ass up. And you got like that first 15 to 30 seconds that sets you up. Manny Fresh sets you up, right? And then imagine that Juvenile give you 1 verse and then it's fading out. You're gonna be like, what?
Well, okay, well that leads me to, do you think, here's my question, do you think that breaks down, or like, we have this definition of the Southern rap, does it no longer mean anything now that there is a disconnection from origin? Is it created to be something else that's outside, that's like a digital version that is not rooted?
Yeah, I feel like we're definitely in the digital South era, and I am not the one to write about it, because I'm not invested like I was in previous generations. I mean, like, I might, but what I mean by that is that I feel like the act of listening has shifted in so much, in a way that the way that I think about the music and the way that I engage it critically, I can't do it, because 1, the albums are so short. Two, it's like I can pick and choose now. Like at one point, you know, it was like, if you give me the album, I need to listen to the whole thing to appreciate what the thematic like the outline is. Now it's like, oh, okay, I don't. Or if I get an artist that gives me a conceptual album, like a Big Crit, for example, you know what I'm saying? And I have to listen from beginning to end. I'm like, oh, okay, I have to actually listen. Like, I can't just be like, I like track 3, track 2, put it on my playlist, boom, I'm done, right? It makes me think about like how folks lose their shit when folks like Kendrick Lamar come out with an album and they're like, this is the best thing since Baby Jesus. You know what I'm saying? And I'm like, well, why is it the best thing since Baby Jesus? I mean, granted, it is great work, but it's also, he gives you a theme that he pulls out throughout the whole album. And that's not something that we have anymore. So I feel like the idea of regional identity in hip hop has shifted in such a way that now we're in a reclamation phase. And this is, I guess, the academic part. And this is also from listening and talking to journalists, is like, we have to go back and set the stage so that we can understand how we got here, because the academy is always playing catch up. You know what I mean? Like hip hop studies has been around for 30 years in 2024, because that's what, you know, or 30 years, because that's when Trisha Rose's Black Noise came out. But I mean, like 30 years in Chronicling Stankonia, and, you know, I'm the first OutKast study. Come on now. I don't appreciate that. I mean, I'm honored, you know what I mean? But I don't appreciate that. But I'm hoping that I hope it sets up, you know, for me. I mean, like, my own theory is that the South still has something to say. The South still got something to say. And then that's what's next, is how do we think about region when region isn't a necessary touchstone for understanding why this particular genre is bumping or why it's important. It's starting to happen to trap. And if we were having this conversation in 2001, it'd be totally different, because we knew that trap was T.I. and Gucci Mane, and there's this dude who's rapping a little bit named Jeezy who go by the Snowman, you know what I'm saying, or Master P and them, right? So I feel like, you know, it'd be a different conversation. Now you put in trap, you got folks in Tibet, you got folks in Russia, like there's Russian trap, it's crazy. You know, from France. So I mean, like, they're picking up the sound, but not necessarily the cultural markers that are associated with the genre. And I think that's what's missing, is actually recognizing and actually engaging with the cultural markers that make this music so popular and make this music so relevant. So I hope that helps.
Awesome. Just time for a couple more. Barry Shank, now, did you feel like this was hitting your question, or did you want to tease out a little bit more from this?
Yeah, I sort of feel like, you know, it got mentioned and discussed, you know, because one of the things my question was sort of about, you know, scenes, and if we need to return to that kind of level of specificity in order to be able to get the depth of analysis that you got, Regina. And that's kind of an academic question, and it sounds boring, and I'm not really interested in that, getting your answer to that. But what I am interested in is the tension that I'm hearing in this conversation between national and international significance and local roots and local specificity, and how, you know, you mentioned how this gets sort of, I don't know, flattened out in the digital era, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about, does great art still require that kind of complex engagement in the real lives of a community in some way, or not? You know, is it more a sort of conversation among creators in a flattened universe?
Oh wow, yeah. I feel like for the work that I do, Barry, that focus needs to stay tight. Because with that, if I didn't keep that focus tight, I really wouldn't have anything to work with, because there's been such an overlook. I think the second part of that is by understanding, you know, where it comes from, the people that it comes from, why it's important. I think it adds to, I mean, like, on the one hand, it does that work that a lot of younger generation of folks aren't doing, which is, oh, you know, it's out there and I like it. And I'm like, well, why? You know, they're like, I like it. And I'm just like, well, why? Why do I like it? But I mean, like, it may, you know, your question also makes me think about something like blues scholarship, for example.
Yeah.
And, you know, blues started in a particular demographic, and it meant something, and then it expanded, and now, you know, and actually it was Portia Mosby, who pointed this out, I never thought about this, is that, you know, when we think about blues festivals, especially international blues festivals, it's majority white attended. And I'm like, you know what? I didn't think about that, right? And then you have like this kind of renewed interest in folks like Robert Johnson, for example. And the Robert Johnson documentary started out wonderful because it was talking to his relatives and it was talking to people that he played with. And, but by the time that the documentary ended,
Right.
it was, you know, it was a bunch of white academics and scholars and blues musicians, and like, this is why Robert Johnson is important. And I'm like, I know that he's important to y'all, but that aspect of where he came from got lost in translation.
Yeah.
And I feel like we're still so early in Southern hip hop studies that if we expand the analysis, it'll get lost in translation before it actually starts to take root.
Yeah.
So that it could be, so that could be there for other generations who want to look back or be like, oh, okay, this is where I can kind of start, which is, you know, as academics, that's really important, right? It's like, we need to know where the root is.
Right. Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Before we wear down the hardest working author in book business, Antonia Randolph, would you like to ask the final question for today?
Sure. Thank you for a great conversation. I was asking a question about different subgenres. I have like a restaurant. Are they part of a different subgenre or something like Dead Prez? Are they part of a Southern hip or different subgenre? So just how do you hear Southernness in variety?
You going in and out a little bit, but how I hear Southernness, I guess, and folks who aren't immediately seeing a Southern, I think you said Dead Prez was an example of that.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think that Charlie Braxton is good for this one because Charlie Braxton is like the pioneer OG Southern hip hop journalist. He's the reason that Aquemini got 5 stars in the source. But I think the thing that, like, you know, just he's kind of brilliant just about music in general. He was like, you know, if it's Black music, it started in the South, period. And I just kind of take that approach. I mean, it might not be somebody immediately recognizable as Southern, but it kind of goes back to the conversation I had with Imani earlier in terms of, you know, the migration aspect of it. I mean, Dead Prez still had people in, I want to say from Alabama. Like, I want to say that his, you know, and regularly visited, right? Like, that's the other thing that, you know, the New York folks don't want to tell you is that, where did y'all go every summer? Where did you go every summer? Did you mean to tell me that you only had on your Timbs and your jeans and then you know what I'm saying, you didn't bring nothing back with you? Nothing besides mosquito bites, maybe?
Thank too.
And what?
Wu-Tang, several Wu-Tang members too. Yeah, they went home, Alabama.
Yeah, I'm like, y'all got the rents. I mean, you know, don't believe me. You believe somebody like Isabel Wilkerson or Warmth the Other Sons. I mean, like, you know, you can literally map out where these folks migrated to and then see the influence on the music. But yeah, I just feel like, you know, if folks keep an open mind and don't try to shut down the conversation, because there's still such a stigma that's associated with Southernness and Southern Blackness in particular that oh, well, of course they can appreciate something that's highly complex and highly, you know, functional, so to speak, like hip hop. Well, I mean, it's not like we just living down here in a bubble, you know what I'm saying? We know that it's there. It might just take root, or, you know, I'm country, so take root differently. But I think that's important, is that, you know, y'all got Southern roots, y'all are country, y'all are distant cousins, you know what I mean? So just make sure, you know, don't forget that part. We'll be all right.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Gina. Thank you, Imani. This was an absolutely terrific conversation.